Hey, welcome. In this video, I'll go through a little bit about what SPSS is, how to install SPSS, how to license SPSS if you're at an affiliated institution, tips with working on SPSS, and running a basic descriptive analysis in SPSS. So we'll start off with what SPSS is. SPSS is the statistical, the acronym SPSS. It stands for Statistical Package for the Social Sciences. And just like that name suggests, it's a computer program that allows you to run various statistical analyses. It's very widely used in academic settings and also in industry because the ease of use with which you can run desired analyses. And as you'll see, it's very kind of point and click, and the analysis is done in the background for you, and then it kind of spits out a result. So SPSS was initially released in 1968 when computation was actually done. Let me show you. Computation was actually done on these cool punch cards. And these are kind of like the precursor to Scantrons. Now, I wasn't around when this was done, but it seems like a pretty cool start. So a lot definitely has changed since then. For example, we don't use punch cards for computations anymore. Another example is that SPSS was acquired by a computer company called IBM. 2009, I believe. A limitation of this is that SPSS is not an open source program anymore. And so the consequences of that are kind of twofold. The first one is that you have to pay to use it because it's not an open source program. And the second one is that changes in the field of statistics aren't really readily updated in the commands in the interface as compared to other open source statistical analysis programs. And this is partially because it goes through a series of reviews and all this other stuff. So, but not to worry, it's okay. Most of what will be required in introductory statistics classes and research methods courses will work in SPSS and more. So you should be okay with that. Also, SPSS has wide agreements with institutions across the in the US and abroad. So most schools, what that means is that most schools would have prepaid a fee so that you could use the license. And so one way to find out if your school actually has an agreement with SPSS is to just look up the name of your school and then type in SPSS. So let me show you what that looks like. So you type in SPSS, let's say UCSC, or the other way around. So I'm at the University of California, Santa Cruz. So here you just look up UCSC SPSS and it pops up. You have a link for students and you have a link for faculty and staff. Let's say you're at another institution, Texas A&M SPSS. You'd look up Texas A&M SPSS, and then it would pop up. Now, as it turns out, Texas A&M students aren't as lucky as the University of California, Santa Cruz students, in that Texas A&M students actually have to pay a limited fee, but they still have to pay for SPSS. So go banana slugs. Okay. So let's go through and actually install SPSS. So figure out how in the world you would do that. Well, there's a couple different ways that you can do it, right? So the first one is by going to the institution. You can also go to IBM SPSS. That's another way to do it, especially if you're not affiliated with an institution. This is probably the way that you'd be doing it. So you'd go to IBM, and IBM will have a link that says try SPSS, and you click on that. They'll probably have you make an account, and then after you sign in with all your credentials, it'll download on your system. Since I'm at Santa Cruz, I'm just going to follow the link that the school provides. And so here at Santa Cruz, we have this link. I'll download the one for students. Since I have a Mac, I'd click on this first one. If you have Windows or Linux, I actually don't know. I don't think I know anybody that has Linux, but maybe over in the computer science department. Okay, so you'll see this little DMG package right there. If you have Windows, it'll look a little different. It'll be an exe package, but pretty much the steps are the same. So go ahead and continue, let it install, agree, choose the place. It's going to take 1.4 gigs of storage, which is fine. Oh, that was pretty quick. Okay, here we go. So this is what it'll look like once you install SPSS. Once the licensing is complete, it'll download a bunch of these dependencies, and you'll just click on Finish. And then the installation was successful. You can close that. You can move the installer to trash. You don't need that. And so what you'll find, what was installed on your system is actually this, a couple different applications, but the one that you want, I'll drag and I'll actually put it on. Whoops. We'll drag it and put it in here. And so what you'll want is this thing that says SPSS statistics on it. And so when you open it, if you've licensed it correctly, whether that's through your institution or by buying a personal code, something like this will pop up. Okay, so this is just my data that I've been working on, but this is the real. This is the this is what you should see. So let's talk a little bit about tips when we're using SPSS. So when you first open SPSS, you should be greeted with this data editor window. This is one of the two important windows that you'll see in SPSS. So the second one, as we'll see in a little bit, is called the output window. That's where your analyses get spit out. So you can view the data in two different ways when you're on the data editor window. So the first way is what you're seeing now is called the data view. The data view shows your actual data associated with your different variables. The second one is the variable view. And the variable view shows you information about your specific variables. So let's start with the data view. So in the data view, you of course have an indefinite number of slots, and this data view, right, is in this orientation, you can manually input data into the sheet. So in this way, SPSS is very similar to other data sheets like Excel or Google Sheets. So one thing to do keep in mind is that you could start entering variables here. So let's say 1, 2, 4, 5, whatever, 6. Actually, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 9, 10. Okay, let's say that. Now, one thing to do keep in mind is that if you were to say go to variable, whatever this is, 8 or 9, whatever, and input one value here, SPSS does this thing where it fills out the other boxes with missing values. So it assumes that because you're dealing with variable, whatever this one is, 10, that you also have variables 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and on. So one way to not have that is to enter in the variables first, which we'll look at in a second. So in the top right, there's a convenient display right here where it shows you visible how many variables there are. It shows you how many variables you're dealing with, and this is sometimes helpful when you have 30, 40 variables in one data set. So it becomes useful to know how many variables in general you're dealing with. So if we remember that the definition of a variable is that a variable is something that has at least 2 levels, something that varies, we can begin to see how we're going to input this data into variables. So Let's look at the variable view. So in SPSS, the way that you input levels of variables is playing with a variable view. So in the variable view, what it gives you is gives you the name of the variable, right? So let's maybe switch this to test variable. So one thing to keep in mind here actually is that when you are making variables, you cannot include spaces in the actual name of the variable. So if I was to click test space variable, it would actually come up as an error because spaces aren't allowed. The way to get around this is to include an underscore between where you wanted to put your spaces. But however, you can insert spaces in the label of your variable. This is a test variable of scores 1 through 10. Now, what this allows you to do is when you're doing the actual computation, it allows you to see what the description of the variables are, because sometimes just having a name test variable isn't really as informative as, for example, the test variable is, a range of scores from 1 to 10, right? So you can pick the width of your variable, so how wide, how many numbers you have there. You can pick the decimal points of your variables. So since we're dealing with whole numbers, I'll switch that to 0, so 0 decimals. Then you can have your label, like I've pointed out. Values, missing data, columns, you can align it. And lastly, this, I feel like measure and perhaps role are the two. So name your variables, label your variables, choose the decimals, and also a really important part of this is choosing your scale of measurement or how your variable is actually being measured. Now, this is a very important step because what you're saying in this step is, hey, SPSS, this is the way that I'm measuring this particular variable. So now, as you'll notice, there's three types of scales of measurement here. There's scale, ordinal, and nominal. Now, if we think back to maybe intro stats, right? There's 4 different ways to, at least 4, to measure variables. So we got nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio, but somehow there's only 3 here. Well, SPSS does this thing where it actually combines interval and ratio data together. So it treats them very similarly. So if we do have either interval or ratio scale data, we would just select scale, right? If we had, for example, participant ID numbers, right? And there's no particular, well, you know what? Yeah, there's an order to participant ID numbers. There's actually a separate thing for IDs, but you would just pick ordinal, let's say. Or if you're talking about race, for example, you're asking for race or ethnicity from your participants, it would be a nominal category. So that's where you would switch it. But our scale from 1 to 10, just an example, it's a scale measure. It's a scale measurement. At least you want to tell SPSS that. And lastly, the role. So you can choose the role that your variable plays in the analysis. So it could be a dependent variable, right? It could be none, it could be excluded. It can partition or split your data set. So we just want it to be input, right? We want that role to be input because it's just a variable that we are inputting. It's not anything that's splitting our data set or anything like that. So let me go through some of the useful, so now that we're done with that, let me go through some of the useful buttons here. So this is kind of starting to run basic descriptive analyses on these data. So after inputting the data, you'll want to pay attention to this top menu bar. So there's two things that I think you should pay attention to, is this menu bar right here, and also the menu bar in your on your actual computer. So this menu bar has some useful things. So you can open up new data sets. You can save this data editor, which we'll get to in a little bit. You can print the data editor. This is a super cool thing. It's the going back and going forward. So let's say you messed up, you inputted something that I think you saw me do this earlier, where I was giving the example of how SPSS fills in missing data. if you input a 5 and you accidentally did that by mistake, you can click on the undo function and then undo button, and it kind of goes back. You can also use hotkeys. So these are kind of shortcuts on your keyboard. So for example, if you click on Command or Control Z, it activates this undo function. And you can play around. You can just Google SPSS hotkeys, and it'll give you a list of the commands that you can do right from the keyboard. So this is a useful function. This one's actually not highlighted because we need to click on a variable for it to be highlighted. This is actually the button that I'll show you in a second, but this is the button to run descriptive statistics on your data. So if you need a basic kind of how many data you have in that category, what's the central tendency of that data, what's the range of that data, then you would just quickly click on that button and it would spew out frequency analyses. It would compute frequency analyses for that data. Observe, let's see, is there anything else? Yeah, so, and then also the way that you would search for documentation. Oh, so this is about splitting your file or splitting your data and selecting specific cases. The way that let's say you don't know how to do something in SPSS, so you would just search the documentation here, and typically, just click on it, and it kind of takes you to that test. So that's another real easy way to be able to do that. To just search something up is like a Command F in SPSS. So super useful. So one way we can, if we are doing, basic descriptive analysis, we could just type in descriptive right here, and then either frequency or descriptives. We can click on it, and all of a sudden we're taken to the descriptives menu. Okay, so now we got that. Let's try running some basic descriptive analyses on SPSS. So there's a couple different ways to do it. I just showed you one, which is basically just searching up the command. Another way to do it is through, well, basic things like descriptives are easy to do from this top menu bar, but the more complicated things aren't going to be there. Where they are going to be is in your computer menu bar. So for example, power analyses, descriptive statistics is what we need, some Bayesian methods, correlations, regressions, survival tests. So as you can see, a bunch of different tests, a bunch of different analyses that SPSS could compute for you. So what we're interested in is actually the descriptive statistics, because we're just running basic descriptive statistics on our data. So one way to do it is going through this menu bar and clicking on descriptives. And then if you'll remember from just like a couple minutes ago, this same window did pop up when we searched for the documentation, when we searched inside SPSS. So it ends up being the same exact thing. We end up getting to the same place. So in this case, what we'll do is we'll pick our variable. And as you can see, this is why data labels are actually quite useful, because instead of giving me just the variable name, it actually gives me the label of that data. And that kind of tells me what's going on with that variable, right? In a way. And so if I put my mouse on it, I can see that, well, it's actually the test variable that I was working on, but the description of the test variable is that it ranges from scores 1 to 10. So what I'll do is I'll drag it into the variables, very point and click, very easy. And what you do, if nothing else, you just click on OK. And here we go. This is what ends up happening. What we see is an output window comes up, and in this output window, what we've got is descriptive statistics for that particular variable. If you had more variables, you could click multiple variables and more descriptive statistics would pop up. So let's just quickly interpret the results. So for example, it's telling us that our sample size is 10. That means we have 10 scores. We inputted 10 data points. Our minimum value is 1. Our maximum value is 10. Our average value is 5.5. And our standard deviation is 3.028. And that really takes care of running basic descriptive analyses on SPSS. The last thing I want to talk to you about is saving your work on SPSS. So when working in SPSS, especially with large data sets, you'll want to save both the data editor, so that's this window, and the output where your analysis is. So let me go through how to save each one of those. So your data window, right? If it's untitled here, it'll show. One way that we know that the data is not saved is that if you look at this corner right here for Mac, I'm not sure that Windows does the same thing, but for Mac, there's a little red circle inside the red. And so if you try to close that, it'll actually tell you, wait, stop, don't do it. It's not saved, So how do you save this data editor view? So the way that you save it, you can use a hotkey, Command or Control S, or you could just click on Save This Document. And what it'll do, let's go on desktop. What it'll do is we type in something for it to save as. So in this case, we're saving it as intro SPSS lecture data editor file. And so it should pop up, as you could see, it popped up right here. I'll put it right here just so we can see it. So now my data editor view is saved. Now, this will become a lot more important when you're working with big data, especially if you've loaded a big data set into SPSS and then you've done some kind of manipulations to the data set, right? So it's important to then, you do want your work saved on the data that you're working on. So make sure to do save both the data editor and the output. So that's the data, that takes care of the data editor. How about the output window, right? So one way to do it, so SPSS is really good in this, in that you could actually just hotkey copy, and you can also, what is this, right click and then copy this table onto, a Microsoft Word document or a Google Docs sheet. So one way you could do that is to copy this table directly over. Another way to do it is to actually save this output in particular. So what we'll do is we'll do the same thing, intro SPSS lecture data file, not data editor file, this is output file, okay? And then we can load that onto the desktop. Perfect. Actually, not the iCloud desktop. We want the regular desktop. We don't want the iCloud. Okay, there we go. Save that right here. So slightly different data formats. So this one saves in what's called an SPV. The output, and then the actual data editor frame is saved in .sav file. So slightly different file names. Now, what is a third way that you can save your work on SPSS, not having to save both those editor views? Well, actually, data editor view, you're going to have to save because there's no way to not save that. But the output, there's actually another way that you can do this. So SPSS, like any other computer program, works with code, right? That's how computers kind of communicate. And so the SPSS platform works on a coding programming language called Java. And so this is Java up here. So you told SPSS by pointing and clicking to do specific commands, right? And these commands were carried out. And after that, you get your table of descriptives. What you can do, instead of saving the table, instead of saving the whole output file, is just save this Java commands. And if you save these Java commands, then you could come back to it and just run it in SPSS as a script, and you point it to the data editor which you wanted to extract the data from, and then you should get the same table of descriptive statistics. So that's a third way that you can do that. So yay, we've learned some basics on SPSS, and I can't wait to see what analyses you'll be running. See you in the next video.